A 9-year-old girl walked out her front door on a Wednesday morning, lunchboxes in hand, heading to school less than half a mile away. She never arrived. By that same afternoon, she was gone, found at the bottom of an abandoned coal mine pit, more than 2 miles from everything familiar to her. The man who did it walked away. He lived freely for 16 more years. He died of natural causes, and for 4 more decades after that, his name remained a mystery buried somewhere in the silence of an unsolved file. 58 years, 230 investigators, more than 4,000 pages of documents, monthly DNA checks for 15 consecutive years, and still nothing. No name, no answer, no justice. Until a college student sitting at home during a pandemic decided to send one email. This is the story of Maureen Ann Civarella. This is the story of how Pennsylvania's longest-running cold case was finally broken open, not by a seasoned detective or a federal task force, but by a 20-year-old history major armed with nothing but genealogy skills, a laptop, and the kind of stubborn belief that some questions deserve answers no matter how long it takes to find them. To understand what happened on March 18, 1964, you have to understand where it happened and what kind of place Hazleton, Pennsylvania was at that moment in time. Hazleton sits in the northeastern corner of Pennsylvania, roughly 80 miles north of Philadelphia, tucked into the coal-rich Appalachian foothills, where generations of working-class immigrant families, Slavic, Italian, Irish, had built their lives around the anthracite mines. These were tight communities, multi-generational Catholic, built around neighborhood churches and parochial schools where the rhythms of daily life moved in predictable, familiar patterns. Parents worked shifts, children walked to school, neighbors knew each other by name. It was the kind of place where no one thought twice about a child walking alone to school in the morning. That kind of trust was simply part of the fabric. America was still shaking from the assassination of President Kennedy just 4 months earlier. The country was grieving. But in Hazleton, ordinary life continued the way it always had, quietly, stubbornly, the way working-class towns tend to do even when the world around them feels unsteady. Maureen Ann Civarella was 9 years old, a third grader at St. Joseph's Parochial School, the heart of the Slovak-American Catholic community in Hazleton. She was a thoughtful child, the kind of kid who carried lunchboxes to school that morning, not for herself, but as a kind gesture for her teachers. Small, generous, ordinary. The kind of detail that stays with you. She left home just after 8 o'clock that morning. Her family watched her go. The walk to St. Joseph's was one she had made dozens of times before, down familiar streets lined with familiar houses. A route so short and so known it should have been completely safe. Somewhere along that half-mile stretch, a man took her. He raped her. He strangled her. He drove her body more than 2 miles across town to an abandoned coal mine pit and left her there. That same afternoon, an elderly man teaching his teenage grandson how to drive on the outskirts of the city stopped near that mine pit and saw something that didn't look right. He called the police. And what officers found there confirmed the horror that the Civarella family had already started to feel the moment Maureen's teacher called home, asking why she hadn't shown up that morning. Maureen Ann Civarella, 9 years old, cause of death, asphyxiation from strangulation combined with sexual assault. Still beside her body when they found her, the lunchboxes she had been carrying for her teachers. Pennsylvania State Police investigators moved fast. This was the abduction and murder of a child in broad daylight in a small town where everyone knew everyone. The pressure was immediate and intense. They collected biological evidence from Maureen's clothing that very first afternoon, semen preserved and cataloged under standard forensic protocols of the time. In 1964, that evidence could tell investigators one thing: blood type. It couldn't create an individual identity. It couldn't be compared to a national database. It couldn't do anything more than slightly narrow a pool of potential suspects. But it was there. It was cataloged, and it was preserved. What followed was a sweeping investigation that dragged through weeks and then months with no definitive answer. Investigators canvassed the neighborhood. They interviewed drivers who had passed through the area that morning. They cross-referenced blood types. Suspects appeared and were systematically eliminated. This one had a confirmed alibi. That one's blood type didn't match. Another had no realistic opportunity. No name survived all the checks. And James Paul Forte, a 22-year-old bartender living just 6 blocks from the spot where Maureen was last seen, whose blood type did match, who had no documented alibi for that morning, who had previously been charged with a violent sexual assault, was never, according to any recorded investigation file, formally questioned as a suspect. His door was apparently never knocked on with the right questions during that initial sweep. He went about his life. The biological evidence sat in storage, waiting for a future that 1964 could not yet imagine. What separates the Maureen Civarella case from most unsolved murders in American history is not that it was nationally famous or politically charged. It wasn't. It was a cold case in a small Pennsylvania city that most people outside Luzerne County had never heard of. What separates it is the sheer, unrelenting institutional persistence of the Pennsylvania State Police. More than 230 investigators worked this file across the decades. That number spans generations. Detectives who opened the case file fresh out of training and worked it until retirement. Others who picked it up mid-career and passed it along. The file accumulated more than 4,000 pages of documents across 58 years. That's roughly 70 pages per year, every single year, in a case with no suspect and no break. As forensic science evolved, so did the investigation. Improved blood typing in the 70s, protein electrophoresis in the 80s, and then, when DNA technology finally matured enough to do the impossible, investigators went back to that original biological evidence collected on March 18, 1964, evidence that had been sitting in storage for 43 years, and in 2007, the Pennsylvania State Police DNA lab extracted a full, complete genetic profile of Maureen's killer. Think about that. Evidence preserved for over 4 decades. Technology finally catching up to what the investigators of 1964 had already banked on, even if they couldn't have known it. That DNA profile was uploaded to CODIS, the FBI's National Criminal DNA Database, and checked against every profile in the system. No match. Maureen's killer had never been convicted of a felony. His DNA was nowhere in the system. CODIS, for all its power, could only match against what it already had. And this man, dead since 1980, had never given law enforcement a reason to catalog his genetics. So investigators did the only thing they could do. They kept checking every single month for 15 consecutive years. The profile was run against CODIS. Every month, the same result. Nothing. 15 years of monthly silence. And still, the Pennsylvania State Police never closed the file. Maureen had 4 siblings. Her younger sister, Carmen Marie Ratsky, was one of them, a girl who grew up in a house where one chair stayed empty, where a name was spoken carefully, where a question without an answer shadowed every family gathering for nearly 6 decades. The Civarella family knew from the very first afternoon what had happened to Maureen. There was no long and agonizing period of wondering whether she might still be alive somewhere. The worst was confirmed immediately. That certainty is its own particular kind of grief, heavy, permanent, with no false hope to soften it. What the family did not know, and would not know for 58 years, was who. No face, no name, no person who could be called to account for that morning. Carmen grew up and grew older, carrying that absence alongside everything else. She maintained contact with investigators over the decades. She asked for updates. She received calls telling her the case was still active, still being worked. In 2019, when the Pennsylvania State Police partnered with Parabon Nanolabs, a company that can generate predicted facial images directly from genetic material, 3 composite sketches were released publicly showing what Maureen's killer might have looked like at ages 25, 40, and 60. The images showed a white male with dark hair and distinct features reconstructed entirely from DNA sequences. The technology would have seemed like science fiction in 1964. In 2019, it was real and it was released to the public. Tips poured in. People across Pennsylvania looked at those sketches and thought of neighbors, former co-workers, men they'd known in Hazleton decades back. Every tip was followed, none led anywhere. James Paul Forty had been dead for nearly 40 years by then. No one connected those features to a man most of Hazleton had long since forgotten. But those sketches did something else, something investigators hadn't fully anticipated. They brought Maureen's story back into public consciousness on a scale it had never reached before. Pennsylvania media covered it. Cold case communities shared it online. And the story of a 9-year-old girl in Hazleton in 1964 reached people who had never heard her name. One of them was a college student in New Jersey, sitting at home during a pandemic, scrolling through articles with too much time and a very specific set of skills. Eric Schubert had been fascinated by genealogy since he was 10 years old. What started as building family trees for relatives had evolved into something more serious, helping adoptees find biological parents, tracing ancestry through DNA databases, learning to read the language that human genetics writes across generations. By 2020, Schubert was an 18-year-old junior history major at Elizabethtown College in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. The pandemic had sent students home. The usual rhythms of college life had stopped, and somewhere in that unexpected stillness, Schubert read about Maureen Ann Civarella. He later described the moment simply, "I just read about how horrific and disgusting the crime was. It really hit me, and I knew if I could, I really wanted to help." So he sent an email to the Pennsylvania State Police. Not a long email, not a dramatic pitch, just a straightforward offer. "I'm a college student. I have genealogy skills. I read about this case. If it won't interfere with anyone's work, I'd like to help." Trooper Petrosky received that email. He described the internal conversation that followed. Accepting a volunteer college student to work on a state police cold case was, by his own admission, a little outside the norm, but they said yes. That yes changed everything. Genetic genealogy, the method that had famously identified the Golden State Killer in 2018, works differently from CODIS in one critical way. Instead of matching a suspect's DNA directly against a database of known criminals, it looks for partial matches with distant relatives, people who have voluntarily uploaded their own DNA to public platforms like GED Match or Family Tree DNA to find cousins, trace ancestry, discover biological family. Ordinary people with no connection to any crime, whose genetics happen to share a branch with a killer's family tree. The closest match Schubert initially found in the databases was a sixth cousin. Not a parent, not a sibling, a sixth cousin. Someone who shared perhaps a single great-great-great-great-grandparent with Maureen's killer. The shared DNA was a whisper, not a shout. From that whisper, Schubert began to build. He combed through birth certificates and death records, marriage licenses and census rolls, local newspaper archives and genealogy databases. He traced family line after family line, eliminating branches that didn't hold, following the ones that narrowed. It was meticulous, painstaking, and slow, exactly the kind of work that requires patience that most people simply don't have. "This was probably the hardest genealogy task I have ever faced," Schubert said later. "This was probably the hardest thing I have ever done in my entire life." He worked on the case for 2 years, from 18 to 20 years old, from uncertain volunteer to someone sitting beside law enforcement officers at a press conference, and the family tree kept narrowing. Branch by branch, generation by generation, the list of candidates shrank, until one name remained. James Paul Forte. James Paul Forte was 22 years old on March 18, 1964. He was not a stranger to Hazleton. He was born there, raised there. He worked as a bartender, a man whose job placed him at the center of community life, whose face was familiar, whose presence on any given street in Hazleton would have raised no questions from anyone. He lived 6 blocks from where Maureen Civarella was last seen alive. He had a prior charge for violent sexual assault against a surviving victim, a history that made what happened on March 18th not an isolated act of violence but evidence of a pattern. After that Wednesday morning in 1964, Forte continued living in Hazleton. He worked. He moved through the same community where the Civarella family was learning to carry their grief. He was never questioned. He was never charged. He was never connected to the investigation in any documented way. In May 1980, James Paul Forte died of natural causes at the age of 38. He had lived 16 years after killing a 9-year-old girl on her way to school. He died without ever being called to account for it. He was buried, and 42 years later, investigators came to dig him up. When Forte's name emerged from the family tree, the Pennsylvania State Police faced one final, irreversible step. Forte was dead. There was no living person to collect a swab from. There was no shortcut. In January 2022, they exhumed James Paul Forte's remains. Samples from the exhumed body were sent to the lab for direct comparison against the DNA profile that had been built from the biological evidence preserved since 1964 and fully analyzed since 2007. On February 3, 2022, the results came back. The DNA from James Paul Forte's remains matched the DNA from Maureen Ann Civarella's clothing, the clothing collected on the afternoon of March 18, 1964, 58 years earlier, with a degree of certainty that defied any meaningful doubt. Pennsylvania State Police described the statistical confidence this way. To find another person with a matching profile, you would need to search more than 4 million versions of planet Earth. Combined population of every human who has ever lived on this planet, estimated at around 117 billion people, and that number still wouldn't be enough. James Paul Forte was Maureen's killer. There was no longer any question. On February 10, 2022, the Pennsylvania State Police held a press conference in Hazleton. The room was packed, not just with journalists, but with active and retired investigators from multiple generations, including the original officer who had worked the case in 1964 and lived long enough to stand in that room and hear the answer. Maureen's 4 surviving siblings were there, her extended family, and Eric Schubert, 20 years old, standing beside career law enforcement officers as a full colleague, because that's exactly what he had become. CPP Mark Barron, the lead investigator, addressed the room with both clarity and visible emotion. This is a very important day for our agency. Even though it took nearly 58 years to solve this case, I think this should give hope to victims' families across the state and across the country. No matter how long it takes, we will never give up. God bless. In life or in death, you will be found. Carmen Marie Ratsky, Maureen's younger sister, stood at that podium carrying 58 years of unanswered questions and finally spoke an answer into the room. We have so many precious memories of Maureen. At the same time, our family will always feel the emptiness and sadness of her absence. Our family now knows the identity of her killer. Justice has been served today. The resolution of the Maureen Civarella case didn't happen because of one extraordinary moment. It happened because a chain of decisions. Some made in 1964, some made in 2007, some made during a pandemic, held together long enough for all the pieces to align. Biological evidence collected properly and preserved for decades. A DNA lab that revisited old storage when technology finally made it possible. An institution that refused to close a file for over half a century. A facial reconstruction that brought a forgotten case back into public view. And a college student who read a news article, felt something, and chose to act on it. Any one of those links breaks, and the answer never comes. There are practical lessons here worth carrying with you. If your family has an unsolved case involving biological evidence, contact the investigating agency and ask 2 specific questions. Is the evidence still preserved? And has the DNA been uploaded to public genealogy databases like GEDmatch or Family Tree DNA, not just CODIS? The Civarella case shows that CODIS alone, for all its power, is limited to people already in the criminal system. Genetic genealogy reaches everywhere else. If you have genealogy skills, even amateur ones, know that law enforcement agencies across the country are increasingly open to working with trained volunteers. Eric Schubert was 18 years old when he sent that email. He was a history major, not a forensic scientist. He simply knew how to read a family tree and had the patience to build one from almost nothing. His email changed a 58-year-old case. No one can know which email, from which person with which skill, will change the next one. Maureen Ann Civarella was 9 years old. She carried lunchboxes to school for her teachers on the last morning of her life. She had a younger sister who grew up without her and spent 58 years waiting for an answer. The answer came late, heartbreakingly late. But it came. And it came because people refused to stop looking. Because evidence was preserved when it could have been discarded. Because a state police force treated this file not as a closed chapter, but as an open obligation. Because science kept advancing. Because a college student at home during a pandemic felt something reading a news article and chose not to scroll past. James Paul Forte has been dead since 1980. He never faced a courtroom. He never sat across from Maureen's family and was forced to account for that morning. That absence of formal justice is real, and it matters, and no DNA match changes what was taken from that family. But they know his name now. After 58 years, they finally know his name. And Maureen Ann Civarella, the 9-year-old girl who walked out her front door carrying lunchboxes on a March morning in 1964, is no longer just an open file. She is a solved case. She is a remembered name. She is proof that some questions, no matter how many years they survive unanswered, eventually find their way to the truth.